Hi, good morning, everybody. Um, Welcome to what we hope will be the first in a discussion-oriented series on alternative data. Um, uh, so I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Tracy Shumpert. I'm the VP of Membership and Programs here at FISD. I also run the Alternative Data Council, and while this isn't exclusively an Alternative Data Council program, it's that's our sort of effort to support firms in alternative data, and we hope you'll engage with there as well. So I'd just like to spend a moment thanking our sponsors who've made this discussion fireside chat possible today. Our global sponsors, AWS Financial Services, Cboe, S&P Global Market Intelligence, Tradition Data, and Xignite. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Google Cloud and Refinitiv. We just have a couple of disclaimers. We, like many of your firms, have an antitrust compliance policy. I don't think this will be a problem, but please do not collude during this discussion. Also, this is an off-the-record activity, so please, if you're from the press and you want to quote any of our speakers, please go to them for permission. You are also welcome to engage with us on social media through Twitter or LinkedIn, hashtag below. And now I'd like to start the show. So I'd first like to introduce you to Elizabeth Pritchard from White Rock. She is going to give, I hear my voice level keeps changing very low. So hopefully this is a bit better. I'm next to the screen, but I am going to be switching over anyway to Liz Pritchard. So Liz, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you to have a fireside chat about a topic near and dear to my heart, alt data for market data managers. First off, let's get going. I'd love to introduce Eliza Raphael, who's the head of market data at Schoenfeld. Eliza made the move over to the buy side a little over a year ago, and I understand has already been promoted to be the head of market data there at Schoenfeld. Eliza, you may know, was at the NASDAQ for over 13 years. Most recently as the head of alt data partnerships, and before that was the head of all global data products for the exchange. And Eliza also had prior experience at Bloomberg before joining the NASDAQ. So we're really fortunate to have Eliza here today to talk with us this topic. I'd also like to introduce Mike Shamirda, who joins us from Seven Park Data, where Mike leads strategic partnerships. He has a really interesting role of finding new data sources to commercialize. So we'll hear about that in a bit. Michael joined Seven Park from Bloomberg, where he was for close to 6 years, where he led the alt data acquisition, both in New York and also in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. So really interesting around the world roles Mike has had. And before that, he was a corporate FX trader with Jameson Bank in Toronto. And just a little bit about me, I was at Goldman Sachs for near 20 years in roles all around the bank, building functions and leading teams, working with data. Spent about half my time at Goldman working with internal data to run the bank, payments and books and records, client positions and the like. And then at the global financial crisis, was asked to run market data globally for the firm. And that was my first stint with external data. So super glad to be here to talk with you guys about alt data for market data managers. All right, and just to bring you guys to the present, I left Goldman about 5 years ago, and after a short stint in insurance, I've been working, co-founded a data delivery company, and I have been working and left there about a year ago, and over the last year, I've been working with alt data vendors to bring their products to market in finance. Okay, now that we're done with the introductions, let's focus in and center in on the topic. And just to kind of get into the mind space of alt data, take a look at the curve we're all familiar with, this exponential growth of unstructured data in the world, from mobile, social, business exhaust, and you see this exponential growth not only of unstructured data, but you also see growth in structured data. And we're all looking to find ways to examine all of these different categories of data on the next slide, which is, I believe there's 24 categories here on this Eagle Alpha slide, which covers a number of different sources, if you will, of alt data, all the way from credit card data to sentiment data to web scrape data. So all of these different data sources are being utilized across finance. Some firms a lot more than others. The pioneers and the early adopters have been using alt data for over a decade. And many firms, maybe your firms, are starting to utilize it maybe in the lab, maybe you're starting to do it in production now. And so what we want to move along to is really exploring how market data managers who have been working with structured data, fundamental data, prices, corporate actions, event data, how you can move into this whole world and make use of alternative data. So why don't we start with kind of some short stories and kind of the light bulb moment of how you, Mike and Eliza, got involved with alt data. I mean, I remember back, it was over 10 years ago, I think it was like 2009. I was new in the seat at Goldman, and our commodity traders, they really wanted to learn more about oil inventories, right? To be able to better discover price, where's the price in the market. And I first learned about this company that provided, flew planes over, oil storage tanks to ping the tanks and figure out how much, oil was in the tanks so that they had a better read on the oil supply to inform price. And that just was the opening bell for me to realize how important new types of data were going to be, certainly for Goldman, where I was at that time. So how about you, Eliza? You transitioned to the alt data leadership role at the NASDAQ. What brought this about?
So, NASDAQ is notorious for being sort of at the forefront of technology, and data obviously is the lifeblood of the exchange. And so I had spent about 10 years on the market data sales side, and we were starting to really evolve into more of the alt data landscape. We were hearing the sort of rumblings from our customers. And so we launched what was then called the Analytics Hub. And so I was brought in the early days to really help try and find supply. So I was working on the partnerships and trying to really identify companies that might have data that they hadn't capitalized on. And it was a really interesting time because it was the earlier days of sort of mainstream alt data. So you're talking to companies that had never in their wildest dreams thought about selling their data, let alone to Wall Street. When you think about some of these Midwestern companies that don't really even know what a hedge fund is, or what somebody might do with their data. So it was a lot of really interesting introductory conversations about what the market's looking for, how they could capitalize on it. But it's also a lot of sort of risk mitigation, right? Helping them truly understand that it's not a dangerous place to play, that Wall Street and hedge funds are not sort of the big bad guys that sometimes are made out to be, and that there really is a real opportunity for them. So that was really the turning point in my career, where I was given the opportunity to sort of take this project on and work with the suppliers to really try and find some really interesting sources of data.
Really cool. And Michael, what about you? When did you first get involved with alt data? And we have a question coming in from the audience, which Eliza just kind of touched upon. Midwestern firms who have business exhaust data that finance might be interested in. How about you? When did you first get involved with alternative data? And in your role is in sourcing, maybe you could talk a little bit more about business exhaust data and what that really means.
Sure, happy to, and thanks to FISD for including myself and Seven Park in the discussion. So I think my light bulb moment occurred after being in data sourcing for around 5 years, predominantly working across the asset classes in Asia Pacific. So looking at commodities, derivatives, FX. Across the board, just given that it was a relatively small market, and at the time working for Bloomberg, I was in an office of 120 people. So you did pick up a lot of responsibilities there. You didn't have a very narrow focus. But despite all of this variety, what was inevitably the case is you're talking about fixed income, you're talking about bonds. These things in and of themselves are interesting for a while, but I think we can all admit they have their limits of how fascinating they can be, and I'm very happy to finally be in a situation where I can have a conversation about what is alternative data. This cavalcade of categories that we looked at earlier, and the opportunities that you have to solve problems in a myriad of different ways, and how interesting that can be to think laterally like that. I think that was something that really appealed to me about this as a burgeoning asset class. But I think as well, within market data, we're always looking for that opportunity to develop extra reliance on or interest in a particular part of that data source or of that sector. And rather than continuing to do that and think outside of the box, I think that moving over into alt data, and specifically being able to move to New York from our Sydney office and be in what was starting to be the epicenter of when most of these data vendors were spawning and really starting to do well, was quite a fascinating opportunity in itself. And then moving from a situation where we were simply sourcing data to house on a platform to now at Seven Park, where we're building product from the data. So it's a new type of partner that we're looking for, with a depth of quality and breadth that probably wasn't as necessary when you're just redistributing third-party data. So I think alt data, is interesting now, but I think where we are now, it's going to be very different in the years to come as well.
Do you want to give us a hint of what you're seeing?
Well, I think at the moment you're seeing, I would expect there's going to be quite a lot of consolidation of these companies, maybe not so much in a single category, but across multiple categories. But to bring it back to that discussion around monetizing data from a company that is not a data company, and trying to build that out into a revenue stream, probably before, whereas it was either dormant or very, very passive. I think that is where it will become more acceptable, and the rules around what is acceptable and what isn't will become clearer over time. And that's where, this transparency, I think, will be helping with the Alt Data Council. As the more comfort that we can get around the rules around selling data, the more open that a company that doesn't do that as their core business will be to engage.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, the whole commercializing of corporate America and really looking at data, them really looking at their data as an asset that can be productized. We could definitely have a whole workshop on that, let alone a fireside chat question. So super interesting. I mean, and so as you look at these new data sources, right, that either you're creating at Seven Park or creating at Bloomberg, and you look at the traditional data sources that we all know and love, what are the differences? Like, what are you guys seeing? And maybe Eliza, you could hop in here. You went right from traditional, exchange data prices and the traditional products of the exchange, and hopped right into alt data, and now you're on the buy side, and you're looking at, you're responsible for both. So can you compare and contrast for us, like, what's the same and what truly do you think is different?
Sure. I mean, I think it's all data, right? It's all information that is being used to trade upon, whether it's, algorithmically or from a fundamental perspective. I think what's different is really several things. The quality of the data, right? You know that if you're getting an exchange market data feed or a feed from a big vendor, that like it's reliable. You know that you can trust the data, you can trust the integrity of it, you know where it's sourced from. However, when you start to look at alternative data, there's a lot more questions that come up. You know, and things like, where is this data coming from? Is this your own data? Do you own this data? Do you have the right to actually use the data for this purpose? And so those are all questions that, you know, when I was doing it at Nasdaq, we were very, very stringent on compliance, but even at Schoenfeld, we're probably even more so, where we really need to know the source of this data. We need to have, you know, we have a very long, or not long, but a deep compliance check that we do, a DDQ, and I believe that FISD is one as well that we've leveraged. And it's really a due diligence questionnaire to ensure that we are comfortable from a legal and compliance perspective with using the data. You never had that before with traditional market data. You just said, you know, your Refinitiv rep came and said, hey, we have a new product. And you said, great, do we want it or do we not? I would also say that the use cases are really different. So it requires from a market data manager perspective, a really deep understanding of your users and what they need, what they're trying to achieve. Whereas you know that everybody, you know, potentially needs depth of book. They're trading the closing cross, so they need the imbalances to understand how to most effectively and efficiently trade the cross. This is a much deeper level of data. Would understanding consumer spend be something that would be valuable for your quants or your portfolio managers? Maybe, but you really need to have that deep sort of relationship and trust with your teams that you're supporting as the market data manager to really be able to bring to them data that you're confident is clean, you know, reliable. It's not going to go away tomorrow. We've had that happen where a data vendor just sends you an email and says, sorry, as of next week, we're no longer providing this product. And that, you know, it's sourced legally and compliantly with NPI and things like that. And that it's going to be valuable because, you know, they're trusting you to bring to them something that you've already vetted. And so that's really become a big part of the market data manager's role with all data, is really doing that preliminary vetting and ensuring that you have a level of confidence when you bring a data set to the end user.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about the evaluation process? Are you seeing differences, and it just takes a lot longer to evaluate?
Absolutely. I think it's I think that's something that at least, you know, is becoming a little bit more widely understood by the sort of all data vendor community, but it's not just taking a raw data set, raw exchange data and plugging it into your algorithm and it works or it doesn't work, right? Again, it's really understanding how are we going to use this data. A lot of times the data is a little bit messier, or maybe it's in a format that you're not as familiar with. It's a new API or it's something else. So you've got the technical hurdle of, you know, the infrastructure side of actually bringing in that data. And then you've got to parse it out. And if it's not tied to symbology, that's a whole nother process that, you know, needs to be done. I know a lot in the industry has been discussed around, you know, the preliminary upfront work that has to be done to an alt data set before it can actually even be analyzed. And I think the data vendors have done a great job, and the aggregators have done a great job to help the data vendors really get their data to a place where it's more easily digestible and tested. But it still takes, you know, it could take 3 to 6 months for a team to really truly do an evaluation of a data set. And I think that is sometimes a hard pill for the alt data vendors to swallow, because this is a new stream for them. They don't really understand, like, well, why can't they just know tomorrow? And so, you know, working with them to really be understanding. And I think from the consumer side, the buy side, really trying to keep the open lines of communication, right? To share feedback as you get it. I think there's nothing worse than a data vendor just getting radio silence while a trial period is going on. And we've found that if we can at least communicate some level of information about what we're finding or what we're working on, they're very willing to work with us on trial extensions and, you know, and giving us the support that we need. So the evaluation is a critical piece. And the last thing I'll say about that is also just having people who understand the data readily available is extremely important, because as the quants start to dive into it, they inevitably have questions. What does this field mean? How is this value calculated? Where is this derived from? And to have a product person at the alt data vendor who can actually speak to this information from a place of knowledge is extremely valuable. And I think that that oftentimes will make or break sort of the evaluation.
Yeah, so definitely some similarities in the what I'm hearing, the commercials, the pricing frameworks, but the actual looking at the content and evaluating the content and making sure that you understand the use case of the business users. All of that is just very, very important, right? And the due diligence can be a lengthier process. How about, sorry?
So I was just going to say on the commercials, I think it's also really hard to price this data. You know, sort of, there's no concept of kind of like a market price for some of this. So I think that's also been a challenge for both consumers who have a price in mind about the value of the data and the data vendors who have a price in mind, and they're not always aligned. And so trying to find, you know, establish sort of an equilibrium is sometimes challenging.
Yeah, it's a bit trickier. The pricing's a bit trickier, and bringing the data vendors, I'm going to say bringing the data vendors in line. Because you understand as a market data manager and then in alt data, you know, bringing in the alt data expertise, right? Learning that expertise, you have something to compare it to, right? So you can kind of calibrate what pricing should be. And then Mike, and we do have some great questions coming in from the audience that I'd like to weave into a question for you, Mike, and it's around as you're looking at these alt data sources, and this is on the topic of differences between alt data and structured data. How is there a difference? Like, how intense technologically is it to actually shape this data and kind of manufacture this data into a data service that a financial institution can actually make use of? And then if you could also weave into your answer, are you seeing some themes in terms of alt data, the types of alt data that is just kind of more common than other types of alt data?
Okay, well, I think to address the first part of that, there are going to be some data sets that are markedly different from structured data sets, whether it's because of the size or because of the life cycle stage that they're at with their business, where it may not be an established company as such yet. They may have low employee numbers. That's where you have a major difference between alt data and traditional market data, is you might be dealing with a company that is not comfortable selling data. Now, you'll never get that from, we were mentioning Refinitiv before. You won't get a salesperson coming into your office and worrying about whether I should sell you this data set or not. They will sell you a data set if you pay for it. So that's a very different concept for getting a company comfortable with monetizing their data. And that's probably, as you mentioned before, that may be a whole different discussion that we'd be happy to help with. How do you get comfortable with it? What tools do you need, and what people in your business have to weigh in on that? One of the elements of that, of course, is the ETL process. It's the creating some sort of a pipe to your data partner or to the buy side, where it's a repeatable process that doesn't involve a lot of manual intervention, and that's done without exchanging terabytes of data every single day or every single week. So I think creating that process is something that doesn't happen without strategic thinking. But I think that once that's in place, then it can also become repeatable. You can work with multiple partners, or you can utilize the data for other purposes. You may want to re-ingest the data to help you with your onboarding process. You may want to repurpose the output in some way. You may work with a data partner that you wish to resell some of their output. So there are a lot of different options there. But I would say the similarity between alt data and traditional market data is also, you're looking for a partner that has that depth that I mentioned earlier, where if you're looking for satellite data, you don't have to work with 6 different satellite data providers. You can work with 1 or 2, or you can do that vetting, and they might give you nightlight emanation, they might give you traffic movements, and they might give you population tracking of some kind. these things mean that the number of partnerships that you have can be more strategic, more directed towards a longer term partnership. And that together with the fact that if it's a company with a bit more infrastructure and intent, you can work with them during these difficult times. And I can't believe I'm going to be the first person to say the word COVID, but you can work with them during moments of distress when maybe people can't get into the office for whatever reason, or that key man or key person risk is not so much of an issue. That sort of reliance is something that keeps you going, particularly in a case where you're a consumer that needs ongoing data, whether it's because you have a subscription product that you're creating from that data, or you're using that in a multi-factor model that would be significantly impacted if you lost that data overnight.
Right. Can you comment on, as you look across the landscape of the different types of alt data, are you seeing certain types of alt data become almost foundational? What I mean by that is almost kind of traditional, like kind of everybody just has to have it. Can you comment on what you're seeing there?
Well, that's the dream, isn't it? To turn something that's alternative data into table stakes, to turn it into reference data, so that perhaps the price point isn't going to be as high, but if everybody needs it, obviously you've got a repeatable business there with some terrific ARR if you can make that happen. But there isn't, in my mind, a particular category of data that's doing better than others necessarily, but that can change overnight, as it did earlier this year. You've got far more interest in retail spend lately, so the different methods by which you track that have been interesting. I think that there are some COVID-related products that have come about recently that have focused perhaps more on. It's maybe moved more away from social media sentiment a little bit, and more into ground truth style recording of data. But I mean, I think, Eliza, you might also have some more info on that too.
I'd love your read. Thanks, Mike. Love your read on that, Eliza. And then I want to hop to one final question before we move to our networking session.
Sure. I would say I think the news analytics is definitely something that has come more mainstream. There's one sort of provider that, I don't know if we can say names, but I think Ravenpack is sort of like was leading the charge with alt data very early on. And now it seems that there's sort of table stakes for everybody. I mean, even in our shop, where for the teams that aren't even looking at alt data, a lot of them are using news analytics of some sort. I think I'm seeing a lot also of interest around earnings. So predictive of earnings, and it's somewhat to what Mike was saying, but also, transcripts and using a lot of the NLP technology that's out there to really parse out things from earning statements that maybe just reading it, as a human, you might miss. So that's something that's really, really interesting. And I think, the other thing with alt data is there's always downsides, right? If you're looking at any data set, you have to sort of ask, what is it missing? No one alternative data set is really going to be 100% complete, even if you get it from an aggregator who's lumping in multiple sources. So, you have to sort of ask, is it enough? Is it a representative enough sample of the market? If you're looking at credit card spend, or you're looking at, phone traffic, or whatever it may be, is that enough of the market for you to be able to have assurances that the bet you're going to make is based on, a large enough sample size? So I think that's a question that we're always asking, is sort of, what's the coverage? How much history? Those things are how has the history changed over time? Has it grown? If so, if you're getting more and more subscribers on your platform or your app or whatever it may be, how are you looking at that? And how are we comparing today's data to last year's data and to the year before that, and as far back as you may have? I think it's really just trying to understand, to Mike's point, trying to minimize the number of strategic partnerships that you have, because it does become very unwieldy, but also ensuring that you've got enough data and that you can really get as complete a picture as possible.
Yeah, super, super interesting. And it's really amazing how, for example, even on earnings, you could take any category that you guys have mentioned of data, that there are now like second and third derivative type products. And what I mean by that is like earnings. Okay, Yes, you can get the transcript, right, with the NLP, but then you also can get word selection. What is the sentiment on that word selection?
Yep.
You can also get now data sets that are saying, well, what are they really meaning from their intonation?
Exactly.
Quite amazing what's available today. So terrific, guys. What I'd like to do is ask you guys one final question, and Mike, you brought up the word, okay, the virus. I'm super interested to understand what changes you're seeing in your sourcing, in your types of content, how you're bringing in content that has changed. I mean, we're in a new world, and things have changed. And what are you seeing? What impact has the virus? What impact has the volatility in the market, the disconnect market versus the economy? What are you seeing in terms of requirements for data?
All right, well, I don't want to give a boring answer here, but I think I'm going to be less interesting than Eliza. Essentially, on our side of things, and just from what I've been seeing, there's not a lot that's changed really between pre and post. I think that there's even more appetite for data to understand the world that we're living in. I think that that's more relevant now than it was before, because you can't wait for earnings. You can't just sit around waiting for official company announcements. You really need to front run that, and you need to have as much data as possible. So I think that there's a ton of appetite out there. I think that to the credit of the alt data vendors, especially the larger ones, but even down to a couple of people operating out of their garage, I think that as a whole, there's been good consistency in maintaining the momentum that was started, whatever it was, 5 years ago, and I think 3 years ago we saw that kick into a new level. I think now it's maturing a little bit more. But I see this as a time where this data, I think, has increased in value just because of what's happening in the world, and we need to continue to search for creative, intelligent ways to look at this world, and doing so via a number of different methods. So I know that some people have had fortune, like one way or another, working with maybe data brokers, maybe platforms, going to events, going to meetup groups, whatever it happens to be. I think that with the exception of meeting face-to-face, that needs to happen still at a high cadence for us to identify new technology, new players in the market, and to be aware of any of these major, if there's any M&A activity in this space. I think that if we can stay as aware of what's going on as possible, that's where we take advantage and work with the right people.
Eliza?
So I'm gonna slightly disagree a little bit with what Mike said in some capacity. But I think long term I do agree, but I think short term we're seeing a little bit more of a divergence. So the shops and the teams that use alt data are embracing it. They're like, our world has been rocked. Everything we thought that worked in March really just went pear-shaped. Nothing that we trusted really worked. And now things are starting to, come back to normal. And they're saying, where can we use alt data to help? I think the people who weren't really embracing alt data are scared. And they're kind of going back on what they know and what they trust. And they're maybe not quite as open-minded to trying it right now, because they're really just trying to sort of recalibrate themselves and using what they already know. I do think that we will get to a point, and it'll probably be a little bit more long-term, where those people who are a little bit more afraid will hopefully see the value in the alt data, and maybe that will reduce some of their skepticism. But I think that there is that sort of tendency to go to trust what you know and what's worked for you in the past in the face of uncertainty. And the other thing is that, to Mike's point about the conferences, and I think that was really, a critical part of the sort of grassroots effort of alt data kind of growing is all of the events that were happening. At some points, it seemed like every week for certain months of the year. and, just networking with other people in the industry, seeing new faces at data providers or seeing old faces at new providers, and really learning what the trends are. And I know that a lot of these, data vendors the aggregators are doing sort of online events. It's something is lost there. And I do hope we'll be able to get back to in-person events, because it's a great way to source data. But it's good to hear that the smaller vendors are still really kicking, because I think that, we will find a new normal here, and we will have an appetite for off data that's not necessarily COVID driven, in the time to come.
Yeah, absolutely. A new normal. And, a couple of things I'm seeing is, on the one hand, very quant driven firms are bringing in, this notion of nowcasting. So looking at, whereas there was a heavy reliance on back testing, they're now bringing in new sources of data, which are at a minimum updated daily, so they can get a read on what's happening right at this moment, which addresses what you were talking about, Eliza. It's like everything was upside down. The stuff that was working in March happened and it's not working anymore. And so I do see a trend there towards quants looking at data more frequently to get a better sense of the now. And then another thing that I'm seeing is automation, is that if firms need to, there's like this recognition, you said it was about fear, right? It's like, I can't say an expletive, but it's like, we got to get going and we've got to do something to get data in the door faster and easier. And so, and really get it flowing, right? And part of that is being addressed, right, by the work of the FISD, the Alt Data Council, and then, of course, we don't have time to talk about it, but lots of new technology and managed services and things like that can help with that data ingestion. So, in a nutshell, guys, we hope that we are able to kind of at least give you a read of market data managers adopting and innovating with